everyone. Welcome to today's program. I'm Patty Brigham, president of the League of Women Voters of Florida, and it's great to have you here. We have a very important topic that we are going to be discussing, and we've heard from many of you very anxious to hear more about it and ask questions, and I'm delighted to welcome back Ellen Frieden. And for those of you who are not familiar with Ellen, and I'd be surprised if you weren't, but Ellen is an attorney who has spearheaded 2 redistricting amendments in Florida as the chairwoman of FairDistricts now. Her efforts led to the passage of 2 amendments to Florida's Constitution regarding districting, and Amendments 5 and 6. They ban gerrymandering and require new district lines to take municipal boundaries, geographic divisions, and minority representation into account. Ellen has continued to fight for fair districts and just drawing of electoral districts in Florida. Ellen helped lead our lawsuits against the state when the majority party in the legislature illegally drew the maps during the last redistricting process. So with that, I'd like to welcome Ellen Frieden. Thank you for joining us again, Ellen.
You guys are amazing. The League of Women Voters is the very moment that FairDistricts started has been our very most wonderful partner, and it's been so great to have you. I see that there are lots of people on this call, and I'm betting that some of you were actually involved back in 2006. When I started, but frankly, I myself got involved in 2006. The League of Women Voters has been working on fair redistricting in Florida since, I want to say, the 70s, and it might even be longer than that. So you know, we've had some successes, we've had some failures, and I want to talk to you give you a little bit of the history for those of you who weren't here back then, and then tell you what's going on right now. So in 2006, when I got involved in the FairDistricts Florida effort to change the Florida Constitution to prohibit gerrymandering, at that point, there had been 5 or 6 other efforts at redistricting reform that had been undertaken and that had not been successful. So I remember this so perfectly. I got a phone call from some of the people who had been working on the last effort, which was led by, I don't know if Betty Castor happens to be on this call, but it had been led by Betty Castor and a group of wonderful other people. But however, the drafting of the amendments, and this is going back, I think that the programs, that effort started in probably 2003, but in the spring of 2006, the Supreme Court said that there were problems with the drafting, and they ruled that the amendment couldn't go on the ballot. And at that point, a group of people called me and said, Ellen, we know that you have, a lot of interest in this and some expertise in this. Would you get involved in redrafting? And I said, sure, I'll join a drafting committee, and I did. And that then led to the last, that was right around this time of year in 2006, and this is 21. So I guess it has now been 15 years that I've been working on this project. So we redrafted the amendments, and in the course of redrafting, and I'm going to tell you what the amendments say in a minute, but in the course of redrafting, this time we went around and we talked to people all over the country, and especially leaders of African American communities and Latino, Hispanic communities, to make sure that what we were doing not only would protect against political gerrymandering, but would protect against racial gerrymandering. And so it took a long time to draft the amendments, the Fair Districts amendments. But by 2007, the fall of 2007, so over a year after working on this drafting, and by the way, not only working on what legal language we wanted to use, but testing it to make sure that it would be palatable to the voters, that voters would be attractive, not palatable, but attractive to the voters. So we did focus groups and we did polling on the exact language that we were going to use. Then what we learned from the polling, what we learned from the focus groups, we modified the language a little bit. And at that point, it had been vetted with lawyers, it had been vetted with political leaders, and it had been cleared by the Secretary of State to start collecting signatures. And that's what we started doing with the help of the League of Women Voters in the fall of 2007. It wasn't until, this took a long time. And by the way, this was before the legislature had put a shelf life of only 2 years on signatures. So we started collecting signatures. We had lawyers take the amendments. Once we got our minimum number of signatures, the Supreme Court took a look at it. This time we passed, and we knew that we had been cleared for landing, so to speak, of these ballots. These amendments had been cleared for the ballot. So at that point, we went on to collect about 1.5 million signatures, which we needed because we had 2 amendments. And we did collect those signatures on time in 2010. We ran a campaign to pass these amendments, and we won with your great help. So 2010, it was a year where not much great passed, but the Fair Districts amendments did pass. And in fact, I'm looking on the other side of my room here at a headline from the Lakeland Ledger, and it said, a flicker, it called us a flicker of light in the mud. And that's really what it was. It was a very exciting and thrilling thing to know that Floridians understood how devastatingly bad gerrymandering is for our political system. And we won by 63% of the vote. And I went to bed that night thinking, I've done my job. Well, when I woke up in the morning, I looked at my emails to find that a lawsuit had been filed by the Speaker of the House, joined by the Florida House of Representatives, and 2 members of Congress in federal court to challenge the constitutionality of our amendments. All of a sudden, this job that I thought had been finished was totally not finished. And of course, we had been running the constitutional amendments through a political committee called FairDistricts.org. And we immediately formed a 501c3, purpose of which was to protect the Fair Districts amendments. And that was at the end of 2010. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I am the CEO and General Counsel for Fair Districts Now, which is the 501c3, whose purpose is to inform the public, educate the public about the amendments, and do everything in my power and in the power of our organizations to protect the amendments. So what happened? Well, the legislators, by the way, during the campaign, all these PACs that you know about, they all contributed millions of dollars to defeat the amendments because because those in power want to hold on to their power, and they don't really want to have to run competitive elections. They don't really want to, they don't really want to have to really, campaign. They don't want to run on their merits. They want to pick their voters so that their voters really have no chance to pick them. And they want to maintain their power. And gerrymandering, drawing districts for a particular political purpose, is something that they know will keep them in power. It'll perpetuate their power instead of allowing voters to have a real chance at selecting their representatives. So they had spent millions of dollars in opposition to our campaign. And of course, we had to spend millions of dollars to get to win, but we spent actually very little more than they did, because what we were trying to pass was something that really was seen by voters as important and something that they wanted. But then, the legislative leaders, who, by the way, were specifically among those who had been contributing to the opposition of Fair Districts amendments, they all stood up and they had public hearings, and they went around the state. They had 26 public hearings around the state. And they, at every hearing, whichever of the leaders was moderating the hearing at the time, they all got up and said, well, we did oppose the Fair Districts amendments, but now that they're law, we're going to follow them. And we are going to engage in, and this is in 2011, we are going to engage in the most open, interactive, transparent, and fair redistricting ever in the United States of America, not just Florida, by the way, but we're going to follow these amendments and we're going to do it perfectly. This is the announcement that they made. So many of you, I bet, went to some of those public hearings. And one of the things that we didn't understand was, why were they having public hearings without showing us maps that were potential maps that they were considering for the state? And so people were asking for those maps at the hearings. Why aren't you showing us maps? And they continually said, well, until we hear from the public, we really can't draw maps. And this is now in the summer, into the summer of 2012. And when the committee started meeting in the fall, which they did, the redistricting committee of the House and the reapportionment committee of the Senate, it became very apparent that they weren't following the Fair Districts amendments at all. Their maps were, the initial maps that they put out were totally non-compliant. The statements of principle that they were announcing that they were going to follow they twisted the Fair Districts amendments in ways that were entirely inappropriate. And it became very clear to us that the maps that were going to turn out in the 2012 legislative session were not going to be compliant with the Fair Districts amendments. Now I want to stop for a minute and back up a little bit, because I want you to understand what the Fair Districts amendments say and what they do. The amendments say that you cannot draw districts, or not you, the legislature or whoever's drawing the districts cannot draw districts with the intent to favor a political party or an incumbent. And nor can you draw districts that would diminish the ability of racial or language minority voters to elect representatives of their choice and participate fully in the political process. So those are the two primary requirements or prohibitions, if you will, of the Fair Districts amendments. But then there's what the courts ended up calling Tier 2. And Tier 2 is a set of very specific, measurable requirements. The maps are required to be as equal in population as possible. And those of you who are really familiar with this stuff understand that congressional maps have to be exactly equal in population. A deviation of one person, so if it's 753,000 voters, you can have 753,000 voters in one district and 753,001 in another, or 99 in another, but you can't deviate by more than one person on congressional districts. Legislative districts don't have that stringent of a requirement. Legislative districts you're able to deviate under law, prior to Fair Districts. You were able to deviate up to 10%. So when a district deviates in population from other districts, that means that some people have a vote that's more important than the people in the next district if they have more voters in the next district. So we require that districts have to be as equal in population as possible, that they have to be compact, and there are measurable scientific ways of measuring how compact the districts are, and they have to follow existing geographical and political boundaries. And the way the courts ended up interpreting that is that you have to split as few cities and counties as possible. And you also can't use, for example, in one instance, the legislature in 2012 used some FP&L power lines as a quote unquote geographical boundary. And the court didn't accept that and said a geographical boundary is like a major thing, like a river. It's not a brook or a stream. It could be a river. It's a major highway, not a residential street, and that sort of thing. So the requirements are very measurable. You can see them with your eyes. You can know that those are the requirements of the Fair Districts amendments. And we knew, again, from looking at the maps that came out of the process in 2012, that they hadn't followed the Fair Districts amendments at all. These maps were had every bit as much partisan bias as the 2002 maps. They maintained the racial gerrymanders that, while they did guarantee certain number of seats, they limited the rest of the state in terms of being able to add seats that African Americans would have an opportunity to win, or Hispanics would have an opportunity to win. And of course, Fair Districts now, with our lead plaintiffs, who were the League of Women Voters and Common Cause, challenged all the maps in the first instance. We found that the State House map had not been drawn nearly as non-compliantly as the State Senate and the Congressional map. And so at some point, the Florida Supreme Court threw out the Florida Senate map, the initial map that had been drawn. And then they ordered the Senate to go back and redraw. Senate did go back and redraw. Court came back and accepted the redraw, but said that if anybody wanted to challenge that Senate map in a trial setting, that we could do that. So we filed cases. We didn't pursue the State House map because there just wasn't at the time, we felt that there wasn't enough evidence. Now, what we know now is there was enough evidence, but a different kind of evidence. But we pursued court challenges on the state Senate map and on the congressional map. I'm not going to go through all the gory details with you too, but I'm happy to answer questions at the end. We tried the case on the congressional map first. The trial court ruled that it had been drawn with improper intent. And why did the court rule that way? Because in the course of that litigation, which really covered both the Senate map and the congressional map, but I'm 100% positive, also impacted the Florida House map, the legislative House map. The court ruled that those maps had been drawn with improper intent. And what we learned in the course of discovery, and it was extremely difficult to get this information, which I'm going to tell you a little bit about. But what we learned in the course of discovery is that while those hearings, remember those public hearings I was talking about, while those hearings were going on, and they were saying, we're going to do the most fair, transparent redistricting process ever, and we can't draw the maps till we've heard from you, they had already hired political operatives who were working in Republican Party headquarters in Tallahassee and in Washington to draw these maps. And they developed a scheme, and this is the legislative leadership, developed a scheme where they conspired with Republican political operatives to take these maps being drawn by Republican map makers and slip them into the public process by using fake names to submit these maps, and then getting the word to the legislative leaders as to which parts of which maps they should be using. And then it was like a jigsaw puzzle. They took one from this map, one from that map, little parts of the entirety of both the Senate and the House, and probably, but the Senate and the Congress, and probably also the Florida House, though we didn't litigate that, so we don't know for sure. But they took those portions of the maps, they put them all together, they put together these extremely gerrymandered maps. And we were able to prove that in court. So the court ordered, this is on the congressional map, the court ordered the legislature to go back and draw a compliant map on the congressional map. And the legislature went into special session and was not able to agree. This is how fraught with politics this is. The two houses couldn't agree on what map to turn in. And so they came back to court and they said, we can't agree on a map. There was no map from the legislature. So what the court did, and this, again, this is a congressional case, what the court did was, the trial court said, okay, we want all the parties involved to submit maps. So the state house submitted a map, the state Senate submitted a congressional map, and the Democratic Party submitted a congressional map, and the League of Women Voters and Common Cause through FairDistricts now submitted a congressional map. And the court then analyzed those maps to determine which one was the most compliant with the FairDistricts amendments. And of course, the FairDistricts Coalition's map was the most compliant and became law and was used from 2016 till the last election. Now that was the congressional map. We went to have the trial on the Senate case, and an amazing thing happened. the current Senate leaders, who were not the same ones that had been involved, this was already 2015. And they weren't the same leaders that had been there during the first redistricting. They came to us and said, we'd like to settle this matter. We'll concede that you don't have to draw, that you don't have to use our map anymore, and that a new map will be drawn. And our answer to them was, no, not unless you admit that the process that you used was unconstitutional and that the maps that were drawn were unconstitutional. And they actually did, publicly in court. And I'm sure many of you read about it in the paper. It was all over the news at the time. They actually admitted that what they had done was unconstitutional. So we went through the same process of having the map redrawn. The court ordered the Senate and the House to go back and redraw a Senate map. They couldn't agree between the two houses. Same exact thing happened. We all submitted maps. And again, the FairDistricts Coalition's map was selected and has also been in effect from the 2016 election through the 2020 election. So this was a complete victory for Florida. And thanks to the League of Women Voters and so many others who were extremely pivotal in making this happen. So now flash forward, we're at 2022, we're almost at we're in 2021. We're almost at the 22 redistricting. The census numbers, we understand that the apportionment numbers are probably going to be released next week, but the census data, and I'm sure most of you have followed this, the census data isn't going to be released until September. And we find ourselves in an extraordinarily strange position. The legislature has not made a single public statement about how they're going to handle redistricting this year. They have not scheduled a public hearing. The House has announced a redistricting chair, but the Senate hasn't. And only in the last couple of weeks has it been made public that they actually have hired staff directors for each of the House's committees. We have made requests to the Speaker, to the President, to the Minority Leader of both Houses, and also now to the staff directors to have a conversation. Can we talk to you? Can maybe we work with you to try and avoid what happened in 2012? And we've been met with crickets, basically, other than one email back from the Speaker of the House, which said, I'm not available, period. I mean, we didn't ask for a time. So this is what, we don't know what they're going to be doing, how they're going to cheat this year, but I think it's pretty clear that they don't want the public to know anything about what they're doing, which is very consistent with how they've run this last legislative session. So here we are. We have a legislature that seems very committed to doing as much as possible in secret. We have a court, a Supreme Court, that is essentially dominated now by the same people who were the dissenters in every one of 8 opinions or 9 opinions from the Florida Supreme Court last time. And we are feeling like our best way that we can work on redistricting is and this is what we've done, is we have a coalition of probably 40 or more, maybe 50 organizations, all of whom are learning about redistricting, are going to be communicating with the public and their members about redistricting. We're going to be making demands, public demands of the legislature to conduct redistricting in a transparent way. By the way, in previous redistricting cycles, the redistricting committees have always been formed in the session before the redistricting session, which would have been this past session. And they always have meetings so the members can learn about redistricting and establish their processes and that sort of thing. None of that has happened this year. And we have every reason to believe that it's going to be a pretty grim situation with very little that the people can do about it, other than the possibility of going to court, which would more than likely, you know, we would certainly want to have the ability to go to federal court, which is somewhat limited, but we're going to be looking at that, and we're going to be looking at every other possible method of fighting back that we can. So that's what I have to say at the outset. I hope some of you have some questions, and I'm here to answer them for as long as you guys have.
Ellen, thank you. And yes, there are a number of questions, but to start us off, is there any state that is approaching redistricting in a nonpartisan manner? And if so, do you have a good example?
Well, there are. The answer to that is really, redistricting is the most political and partisan thing that ever happens in state government. So let's start with that. There are a couple states who have formed redistricting commissions, and really what has happened in those states, none of those states are like Florida. Well, there's Arizona, which is probably as close to Florida as you can get in terms of it being, at least proving itself now to be a swing state. They have a redistricting commission, but there are partisan battles that go on within, and lawsuits where people are accusing the commission of either being too democratically oriented or too Republican oriented. So the answer is pretty much no. The one state that isn't partisan in its redistricting is Iowa. Iowa has a tradition that goes back decades, maybe forever, I don't know, of having certain public servants, people who head up different parts of the government, who are neutral, actually draw the district lines. And that's been their tradition forever. And I have never, ever heard that the Iowa redistricting is done in a partisan way. Now, that said, Iowa is so different than Florida. Actually, if you looked at a districting map in Iowa, you know, Iowa's a fairly, you know, squarish, well, I mean, it's not an oddly shaped state, and their districts are all square. It's just like they do lines, you know, and square them off. So it's just totally different than anything in any other state.
Interesting, thank you. And here's another question. If we've passed amendments banning gerrymandering, then why no action on them? Are they waiting for census figures? Well, we know that we're waiting for census figures. Or do they just have no teeth? The people in power still retain power to say how implementation will happen?
Well, they do have teeth. The Florida Supreme Court, as I said, certainly enforced the amendments in 2012. There are 8 opinions that enforce those amendments and do it in a very strong and certain way. So the amendments have teeth. The legislature just ignores it. They don't care that they're violating the Constitution. They take an oath and they just, you know, and you all have seen this in Amendment 4, you've seen it in the medical marijuana realm, you know, it's like put it in the Constitution. They don't seem to care. They don't, it's so unsettling.
Very. Question from Abe and Pat Levy. How can it be that the courts allow gerrymandered districts which defeat the quote, one person, one vote idea on which our democracy is based?
Okay, well, that doesn't happen in Florida. I mean, one person, one vote is pretty well established. One person, one vote it relates to the number of voters that are placed in a district. In the olden days, as I used to say to my kids, what they would do is they would pack a few urban districts into, so that they would pack a large number of voters into a few urban districts, and then the rural districts would have fewer voters. And then, of course, the representative from Miami would have the same vote as the representative from Levy County, so that's what they used to do. One person, one vote means that the districts have to be equal in size. And that doesn't, so the case law, federal case law takes care of the congressional, what I explained, that congressional districts have to have an equal number of people in them. And the federal law says that states can have up to a 10% deviation in population, which is a big deviation. But the FairDistricts amendments say that they have to be as equal in population as possible. So.
Thank you, Ellen. From Joanne Terry, will state laws apply to county commissions? One of the Brevard commissioners suggested drawing lines to help get a minority elected on the county commission. Seems like a wolf in sheep's clothing. Will we have to fight this separately from the state redistricting?
Yes. The answer, well, yes to the last part of it and no to the first part of it. The FairDistricts amendments only apply to state legislative seats and congressional seats. So you will have to fight separately.
Okay, thank you. From Rich Bartholomew, the amendments and previous court decisions state several criteria about political parties, incumbents, minority participation, population counts, geography, etc. When we get to court in the upcoming Florida redistricting cycle, which criteria might we argue as having the greater weight?
Well, what the courts did there are hundreds of pages of case law interpreting these amendments that came out of the 2012 cycle. And essentially what they did is the amendments themselves say that tier one, which are the two provisions, one that says you can't draw with intent to favor a party or an incumbent, and the other that says you can't draw to diminish the ability of racial or language minorities to elect representatives of their choice and participate in the political process. Those are called the tier one amendments. They take precedence over everything. However, those are hard things to prove. So there's this whole tier two section, which technically doesn't have it doesn't take precedence, but you can prove a tier one violation by showing a failure to adhere to those requirements that the districts be compact and that they follow local boundaries and they don't split up cities and counties and that they're equal in population.
Okay. This is from Doug. As long as the legislature creates political boundaries, it appears they will try to create districts beneficial to themselves. Is there any hope to create a commission that could establish political boundaries such as in California and Arizona?
Well, that would have to be done by constitutional amendment or by the passage of H.R. 1, which if it does pass Congress, H.R. 1 contains a provision for a redistricting commission, at least as far as congressional seats are. But remember what I told you about the commission in Arizona. There's tremendous fighting. It's a problem. There is partisan, there is constant suspicion of this commission. So that's a problem. California is a totally different state. California is a democratic state. The issue in California was before they adopted their commission, was incumbent protection, which is also a problem, but basically they would draw districts to ensure that incumbents would be reelected. So different story, different states. Minority, particularly African-American leaders, are very suspicious and uncomfortable with commissions for good reason, because they feel, at least in a legislature, they have representation. There is no way to guarantee, although you can hope to get representation for minorities in these commissions, but there's no way to guarantee that that the commission will actually be sensitive to these minority issues and follow them. So minority leaders have discomfort with commissions. And in fact, we considered doing a commission in the beginning and dropped it, mostly for that reason.
Thank you. This is from Nancy Morrison. The Sarasota Board of Commissioners is very unhappy with single-member districts which were approved by the voters in a referendum. They would like to get around the Florida Constitution's requirement to look at redistricting after the census using census material. Instead, they want to use their own data. This was brought to light in an April 22nd article in the Sarasota Herald Tribune. Would this be legally defensible?
I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I read the article. It sounds awful to me, but I really do not know. I am pretty sure that they tried this before and whatever it was rejected, but I don't know that for sure. So I should have just stopped it. I don't know the answer to that.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. From Jane, were the courts state courts or federal courts?
Well, interestingly, the eight decisions in the large body of law that I was referring to were from the state Supreme Court. But legislative leaders, members of Congress, as I told you, they challenged us in federal court right at the day after the election, but also after the maps came out, there were 3 or 4 other challenges that were trying to invalidate the FairDistricts amendments that were in federal court, but all the federal court cases ended up getting thrown out.
Okay. From Catherine, seems that criteria for congressional districts, equal population, creates another complication, the need for drawing straight lines. She says strange, but I'm thinking she means straight lines in search of the right number of people.
Okay, I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, Catherine. We don't really understand your question. If you could rephrase it in the chat box, that would be great. From Robin, is it a fantasy to imagine that we are far along enough in AI development that using the criteria in FairDistricts, the state of Florida could achieve acceptable maps?
The answer is it's not a fantasy at all to assume that they could achieve acceptable maps. Certainly there's plenty of technology there, but there has to be a will. And that's what's missing as far as we know. I hope that we get to redistricting. That my greatest hope is that we get to redistricting and we find that this legislature is just not going to, they're not going to be involved in what was involved. They're not going to go through the humiliation that the previous legislature went through. That's my hope.
From Kristen, this redistricting will define the 2022 congressional district lines, or will they not go into effect until 2024?
2022.
Okay. And from Linda, where does the money come from for the costs?
For the
For
legislature.
court costs? I'm not sure which cost, Linda, you're specifically referring to.
The legislature has a budget for redistricting.
Okay. From Sandy, why can't the districts be developed via computer-based tools on nonpartisan criteria?
They absolutely could be, but again, you got to have the will to do it.
From Linda, are there only 2 maps?
There is a state house map, a state senate map, and a congressional map.
Okay. From Linda, last election, Broward County voted for fair redistricting, including how and who would do it. Can the state preempt this?
Oh, good question. I don't know.
Well,
I guess they could try. They seem to be preempting just about everything else, right?
They are this session. They love preemption. And wouldn't it be wonderful if HR 1 passed, and then how ironic that the Florida's legislature, who loves preemption so much, would be preempted.
But that will only apply to congressional redistricting. We'll still have to deal with state house and state senate.
Of course. From Jim, do constitutional redistricting requirements apply to municipal redistricting? We've answered that already, I believe. Madison asked this question. I think you said that Fair Florida has a scientific approach for drawing districts. Can you explain that a bit more?
Are you talking about, I'm not sure what you meant. What, I don't think I said that. So if you're asking me, did FairDistricts now use a scientific approach in developing the maps with League of Women Voters and Common Cause? The answer is, of course, we followed the amendments. But you can, there are, you know, from the time I started, the world of redistricting has changed so much in the last 15 years. There are computer algorithms that absolutely could draw maps that would take into account our criteria, and that the maps would be absolutely fairly drawn and impartially drawn. So that exists. But again, you've got to have a legislature that's willing to really use it, or willing to really live with the outcome of that. And you know, as far as I know, we don't have that legislature. I'm hoping we do. I'm hoping that that's what they're going to do.
From Robin, can we say that our current legislature was elected in compliance with the FairDistricts?
The current legislature was elected in compliance with well, let me put it this way. The districts from which the current legislators were elected, the senators absolutely were elected from fairly drawn districts. And the House districts are not terrible. They're not as good as they could be, but they're not terrible.
Okay. This is from Carl. Florida is in the highest risk category of gerrymandering in the Gerrymandering Risk Index. Can you discuss the factors that make Florida so high risk, especially if any present opportunities for citizen education and or pressure points?
Yeah, I think that those are political pundits who are saying that. I don't know whose categories you're looking at. I did see something in some article actually today that put Florida in a high risk. But I think what they're saying is Florida is 100% red state right now in terms of our state government, other than one statewide elected Democratic official. So anytime you have a legislature and a governor who are, you know, all of the same party, you're at a very high risk for gerrymandering. That assumes that there's not going to be anybody there to enforce the FairDistricts amendments. And we don't know yet how that's going to all play out.
Okay. From Bonnie, I've been talking to a political operative in Pinellas County. Been told the maps are close to being done, so much so that it appears on blue congressional districts here will now be red. Is there no way to bring these maps to the daylight?
Well, why don't we talk offline, Bonnie? And Patty, if you put us in touch, that would be great, because I would like to know who's telling you that and how you're where you're getting that information. We'd very much like to know. And it's possible that they're done. You know, they could be doing the same thing that Sarasota is doing, which is just estimating what the population numbers will be, and then they'll tweak them a little bit. And it does not surprise me, because at this time in 2011, the maps were pretty much done. So it doesn't surprise me. However, in 2011, we got our redistricting data in March. So, you know, there is a delay this year. You can't draw final maps until you have the actual data.
Ellen, how receptive will the new Supreme Court in Florida be to fair districts, in your opinion, including potential challenges to the legislature's plans?
We have grave concerns about that because, as I mentioned earlier, the court is pretty much all lined up with the two justices who dissented. Almost every one of those big Supreme Court cases was 5-2 decision. One of those 5 is still on the court. The 2 dissenters are the ones who really are in control of the court right now. So we have grave concerns about that.
From Donna, and she echoes many of our league members. She says, what can we do now? Is there a list of the 40 to 50 organizations that you mentioned, which are coordinating efforts to keep honesty and transparency in the district maps?
So the League of Women Voters is on the executive committee of our coalition. So I would say that there's lots that we can all be doing. We're kind of waiting for the legislative session to be over and hoping that redistricting will start kicking in so that we can start being more vocal. And after the session, it's going to be a much better time to be speaking out. Letters to the editor, op-eds, talking directly to your legislators. This coalition has developed a pledge, and we've been asking legislators to sign the Fair Districts pledge that just simply pledges that they will follow the Fair Districts amendments of the Constitution. So that's something that you can be doing. And we will be providing, and well, I think the league can provide you with even more information about redistricting trainings, learning specific things. Now, if they actually end up holding public hearings, whether they be in person or virtual, we're going to need all of you to attend and to speak. So there are many things that you can do. Let me tell you what the timetable should be. As I said, the apportionment numbers should come out this week. What that means is that in this coming week, we probably will know how many additional seats that Florida is getting. It's expected to be 2. But we don't know with this census. We don't know how much of an undercount there might be with the census. So we're looking forward to seeing that number. And then, but the actual redistricting data from which they must draw the maps doesn't come out till September. So then I would think, in the 2012 legislative session, 2012 is one of the years in which the legislative session is a January, February session. So
you mean next year?
2012. I'm sorry, 2022.
It is. The session starts early. Yes.
Yeah, it's an early year. So in the fall, there will be committee meetings presumably, maybe they won't even have committee meetings. Maybe they'll bring it on everybody. I really don't know. But they're, so this is all going to really, in terms of timing, it's all going to really start heating up in the fall and run through January into potentially February, and then there's always potential for litigation.
Right, and Ellen is correct. The Florida League is gearing up to do a massive education program. We've received a PowerPoint from the League of the US that we're tweaking for Florida. We're going to be rolling that out very shortly. There's going to be a day of action on redistricting. And when you all start meeting with your legislators in their districts after this session is over, not now, they don't have time. But meet with them in their districts, let them know not only are you a league member, but you're a constituent, and we can provide this pledge to you and you can ask the legislator to sign the pledge right then and there. From Rich, what forces the legislature to redistrict in 2022? Could they claim the late release of data and punt on this responsibility?
They're required by the Florida Constitution to redistrict in 2022. Could they use this as an excuse? I don't think they would want to, frankly, because the districts that the districts that they're not happy with the districts that exist today. I can tell you that, because they're way more competitive than they'd like them to be. So I don't know. I don't know. Listen, I'm not going to predict anything this legislature might do.
Yeah. From Jane, if the cases go to the Florida Supreme Court, could they essentially be appealed up to the U.S. Supreme Court?
I don't think so. No.
Okay. Let's see. Well, this is a good question. And this is from Janice. Now, of course, citizen engagement is required for Fair District success. We've talked about that. But Janice wants to know, if so, how do you communicate to almost 50% of the electorate that still believes the 2020 presidential election was stolen?
Well, that's way out of my wheelhouse. I mean, I've heard different numbers. I'm not sure that it's 50% that still believe that anyway, but I think it's 50% of Republicans, which is not 50% of the election. But I don't know. That's not my thing.
I understand. We do the best we can. One of the things I think we do avoid doing is getting into arguments with those firm believers who will not accept the fact that the 2020 election was stolen, because we're never going to change their minds. From Martha, is there a finish date?
For the maps, for the 2022 maps?
Believes that, yeah.
Yes, there is. Under the Florida Constitution, the maps are to be drawn during the regular session of the legislature. Now, there is provision for some reason they don't draw them during that provision. There has to be during the session, the regular session, they have to be, there's a provision for a special session to be called by the governor.
Okay. And with that, Ellen, I think we'll have to conclude with 2 o'clock. Thank you so much for joining us today and explaining the history of the redistricting process, which is sort of a complicated web in Florida. And we are going to be joining you and fighting the good fight again for Fair Districts. So thank you so much again, Ellen Frieden, for being here. Thank you all for joining us today. This has been a great program. Continue to send your questions to our office and we'll do our best to answer them. Thanks, everybody, and have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Patty, for having us.
Absolutely. Bye, everyone.